Make a slap trip.
I be doing shit these niggas wouldn't understand. Stop playing with that man. Where was niggas at when I ran through 200 bands? Stop playing with that man. Where was niggas at when they was trying to get a chair? Stop playing with that man. Where was niggas at when Walton wasn't playing fair? Yeah, stop playing with that man. Stop. Yeah, stop playing with that man. Stop it. Nigga, stop playing with that man. Shit, nigga. Stop playing with that man. Shit, nigga. Yeah, stop playing with that man. Nigga, we ain't playing around. Karate chop, nigga, that's gon' lay him down. I got it from my sensei. A Ku Klux, so I bought me 10Ks. My shooter got me, I made sure his rent paid. A grimy nigga, but he don't wear 10K. He wears a Vinci, he don't even fit J's. A sharpshooter, you should see him switchblade. I be doing shit these niggas wouldn't understand. Stop playing with that man. Where was niggas at when I ran through 200 bands? Stop playing with that man. Where was niggas at when they was trying to get a chair? Stop playing with that man. Where was niggas at when Walton wasn't playing fair? Yeah, stop playing with that man. Stop. Yeah, stop playing with that man. Stop it. Nigga, stop playing with that man. Shit, nigga. Stop playing with that man. Shit, nigga. Yeah, stop playing with that man. Add me on Twitter, that's gon' get you in the jam. Stop playing with that man. 2 to 3 shells and knock a nigga out his frame. Stop playing with that man. Ever been indicted, I ain't see you in that jam. Yeah, stop playing with that man. Niggas acting like fans. Some shit I never understand. Is you gangster or not? That's for Instagram, you don't hang on the block. It's a hunt Diddy, I don't hang with no stocks. You a brand lover, bitch, you bang with the ops. You like felons, cause I came with a lot. A tough cookie put his brains in a knot. How much I pay for these chains, it's a lot. Stop talking money if you really don't got it. I be doing shit these niggas wouldn't understand. Stop playing with that man. Where was niggas at when I ran through 200 bands? Stop playing with that man. Where was niggas at when they was trying to get a chair? Stop playing with that man. Where was niggas at when Walton wasn't playing fair? Yeah, stop playing with that man. Stop. Yeah, stop playing with that man. Stop it. Nigga, stop playing with that man. Shit, nigga. Stop playing with that man. Shit, nigga. Yeah, stop playing with that man. Stop playing with that man. Nigga already know what the deal is, nigga. Yeah, I should already know by now. Don't play with him. We're not the ones to play with. What is money? Don't make us throw it up in the air and walk away. Put a price on your head on a sticky pad. Stop playing. Stop playing with that man. You're not tough. You're not crazy, man. Go crazy, man. Go crazy. Go crazy. Go crazy. Go crazy, they should put me in a straight jacket. Like I'm running on a Greyhound. I'm hearing voices in my head, I'm going crazy, I don't know who to trust. Chrome hearts are heartbroken, I don't know who to love. I'm holding United on the road with a suit and tie. Everybody putting work in when it's do or die. One orange chicken or bologna, I let you decide. I keep a Big Mac on me, yeah, that's supersize you. Go crazy, I'm riding around with 2 Drakes. Wayne Gretzky, the ice on me, don't test me. I won't let you a fuck about probation. I'll spray with these cake clips, play with me. Go crazy, man. Go, 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 go crazy. Go, 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 go crazy. Go, 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 go crazy. Go, go, go crazy. I might be crazy, I got two chopping, shoot a baby, don't got it all. If it's blood on my shoes, I'ma wipe it off. I don't know, cause your friend, I was not involved. I might just crash a performance, just might shoot shots off assumptions. I'm Michael Myers on Halloween. Shit can get tactical, I nod my head. When I'm carrying this faint and knock off dreads. If you see me on the 10, it's bop bop blade 'em. Left all these toppers in the street, yeah, my mia. Say why your cameras from the gram, I'm not gon' see 'em. Go, 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 go crazy, I'm ready. Go, 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 go crazy. Go, 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 go crazy. Go, 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 go crazy. Go, go, go crazy.
We Japanese still. You getting cooked in front of your family? Like a Japanese meal. It's y'all shoot the hibachi and none of you niggas can stop me. But can't help but watch me. Man, we got a great show today. We're going to deal with the peopling of the Green Sahara Yap Gang Demography, right? I'm going to deal with the peopling of the Green Sahara because this came up this week and I wanted to go ahead and read both articles to you guys, both scientific papers dealing with the subject matter, dealing with the peopling of the Green Sahara, dealing with, our parent clade, EM2, E1B1A, when I say our, I'm talking about some of the diaspora. We actually directly descend from Western Central Africans. Some of us descend from Bantu. Some of us descend from E1B1A carriers, which is a male-specific Y chromosome. You can trace that male lineage in common with those in the western coast of Africa. So they have a very intriguing story, and that's what demography shows you. Demography is a study of migrations, right? Migratory patterns, migratory routes, human dispersal events. And with E1B1A, it's very intriguing because, we got people claiming to be Semitic, Shem, Israelites, the whole nine that have E1B1A. So what we did was build a model to try to prove those things out and give it some kind of backbone or some kind of foundation, instead of just yelling scriptures or just Deuteronomy 28 and people all day. We actually wanted to give credence to some of these claims and build a model. So again, a hypothesis is an unproven statement. A theory is an interpretation of facts. So we interpret the facts. We interpret the facts to come up with our theory. And I believe it's a lot better to go that route instead of just saying, well, I'm just going to stick with what the Bible's saying and give you my interpretation all day. No, let's try to interpret facts. You understand? And go from there, and instead of having eisegetical arguments all day. So with that being said, let's get right into it, man. Y'all know how we rock it, man. 7 candlesticks up. 7 candlesticks up. Y'all know how we rock it. So we're gonna deal with the migratory patterns and routes of the Green Sahara, showing you that E1B1A was a part of that, or the antecedents rather of E1B1A was a part of that. They were not always in Western Central Africa. That's actually fairly recent. And again, all the detractors and those that troll or want to hate on all people that are E1B1A, which is weird, E1B1A carriers, because people say sub-Saharan African, but sub-Saharan Africa consists of more than just E1B1A. We just overrepresent sub-Saharan Africans because we were more dominant and successful via the Bantu expansions, or the E1B1A expansions, as some rather call it, right, in sub-Saharan Africa, which replaced and reduced other lineages, people of Pygmy, Sun related peoples and stuff of that nature, A and B haplogroups. But you also have RVA8, which is going to come up in today's papers. That's also in sub-Saharan Africa, right? So we had a gentleman that was on last night trying to claim that all sub-Saharan Africans are the same, and that's just not true. They have different patrolines and matrolines, so you can't peg them all as the same, right? So it's just trying to make sense of these arguments here and see which one is most parsimonious. With that being stated, let's jump right into the meat and potatoes of this, man. Let's jump right into it. The peopling of the Green Sahara. But the first paper I want to read to you guys is a history of male migration in and out of the Green Sahara. And as you guys can see, I'll put this in the chat so anyone can have this article, by the way. And then right below it, I will put the title of the paper as well. As you see, a history of male migration in and out of the Green Sahara by Yali Shu. All right. As you can see on genomebiology.biomed.central.com. So let's get it in, man. Abstract is always a summation of what the paper is presenting. It's a summary. It says the Sahara was once fertile. A recent study identifies human Y chromosomal lineages that flourish in the Green Sahara and their relation to present-day populations, which is huge, especially in regards to E1B1A, because E1B1A outside of sub-Saharan Africa or below the Sahara or Western Central Africa, people attribute that to slave trades. They attribute that to the Arab slave trade, the modern slave trade, so on and so forth, the Romans. They always attribute sub-Saharan Africans solely, or sub-Saharan African groups being dispersed outside of those regions solely to some kind of slave trade as the impetus of migrations. And as we're going to see in this paper refutes that, right? Most people that understand the Arab slave trade, you must understand that the Arab slave trade was primarily sex bias, as we're going to cover in today's episode, and female mediated. So it was mostly female slaves. The males were usually castrated and were not able to reproduce, right? So you're not going to see successions of male-specific Y DNA because those lineages will get cut off because they were not able to reproduce, because many of those slaves were made like Daniel the prophet in the Bible, eunuchs. All right, so let's get to the introduction. It says modern humans originated in Africa at least 300,000 years ago. The migration out of Africa approximately 60,000 years ago was central to human history. But the subsequent migrations and demographic events within Africa, stimulated by climate changes, developments in technology, and other historical factors, remain underappreciated and understudied. A recent study focusing on the consequences of climatic changes in the Saharan region over the past 12,000 years fills one of the gaps in our knowledge of human migration. All right, so we get our time frame here is within the last 12,000 years is what they're using as the parameters. So Y chromosomal lineages from the Green Sahara. Again, Y chromosome shows males, the male ancestry of the peoples of this region. It says the transformation of the Sahara over the past 12,000 years has been profound. A once hospitable environment with lakes, savannas, and animals 5 to 12,000 years ago, referred to as the Green Sahara or the Holocene wet phase, has become a hostile environment that forms the largest non-polar desert on Earth. This transition is expected to have had major consequences for human inhabitants of the region and may have left imprints in the genomes of nearby present day populations. But can these traces be identified? D'Atanasio et al. Focused on the Y chromosome to address this question, and this will be the follow-up paper. We're going to look at D'Atanasio's paper on the peopling of the Green Sahara, and he does a very great job in filling in the gaps and blanks of this region. It says the approximately 60 MBY chromosome is inherited from father to son, and no recombination occurs on most of its length. Therefore, this chromosome gradually accumulates mutations and thus provides a particularly simple and detailed record of human history, at least as it has impacted men. This record is enhanced by the historical tendency of men to remain near their birthplace, leading to a strong geographical structure of Y chromosome types. For decades, dedicated researchers have distinguished Y chromosome lineages using genetic variants, identifying haplogroups, and have established the geographical distributions of these variants. In the past few years, advances in genomic technology have made large-scale sequencing of Y chromosomes feasible, which in turn has transformed the field by enabling measurement of the mutation rate, construction of detailed, well-calibrated phylogenies. It is thus possible to use the distribution of the present-day Y chromosome lineages to infer the historical movements of men. D'Atanasio et al. Hypothesized that because the Sahara has been such a strong barrier to human migration for the past 5,000 years, haplogroups that are found in the current populations, both in the north and to the south of the Sahara, must have spread during the green phase. Previous work had identified 4 such haplogroups: A3M13, EM2, which is E1B1A, EM78, which is a downstream clade of EM35, which is a downstream clade of E1B1B, which is our brother YAP, and RV88. The later prefix specifies the major Y lineage, the suffix, the particular Y SNP that defines the lineage. Targeted sequencing of the Y chromosome of a set of 104 men, most of whom carried one of these 4 lineages, allowed D'Atanasio and colleagues to construct a dated phylogenetic tree. This tree, shown in a simplified form in Figure 1A, revealed the correlation time of these haplogroups. That is the period of time that has elapsed since the most recent common ancestor of the haplogroups lived. These time points mostly lay within the 5 to 12,000 year ago green period, although EM78 showed a more complex history with some older and more diverse lineages. So, for example, all the men carrying the A3M13 Y chromosome are descendants down the male lineage of a single ancestor who lived 10.73 thousand years ago. Although there's no direct evidence that this ancestor lived in the Green Sahara, it is a simple and reasonable inference. And the reason why you have to use inferences and try to interpret the data the best we can is because we have yet to discover DNA, viable DNA from the Sahara region that dates to these times to make definitive claims. So you have to try to make approximates here, and that's what they're doing. It says here, although there is no direct evidence that this ancestor lived in Green Sahara, it is a simple and reasonable inference. Notably, the RVA8 shows an additional striking feature: a very rapid expansion. Visualizes lineages and the phylogeny branching so closely together that no mutation occurred between the origin of the different branches at around 5.73 thousand years ago. And here's the 1A map. As you can see, the green is between 12 and 5,000 years ago. That's the Green Sahara. And as you can see, E1B1A, being involved in that. Green Sahara's North Africa. You can see A3M13 being involved in that as well. And as you can see, these Green Sahara lineages produce the Bantu, as you can see here. So therefore, the Bantu ultimately diverge from North Africans, right? As ISOC said in 2009. This lines up with what ISOC published. It says here, E1B1A is an African lineage that probably expanded from northern Africa to sub-Saharan equatorial Africa with the Bantu agricultural expansion. And as we just saw in the paper, you see that these northern Africans from the Green Sahara branch out and have descendants known as the Bantu clades. That's what we're seeing depicted in this graph here, right? And then these dots here are hypothetical. As you can see, dots, hypothetical, even RV88. Again, a lot of this stuff you have to infer on what we know until we get a better data set, more ancient DNA, more skeletal remains, being able to, extract viable DNA from these groups to see what ancient people actually died there and lived there or what have you. You have EM78 here. There is no dotted lines here because we actually found the Ibero-Maurusians in northwestern Africa. So this is back with ancient DNA. That's why it's a solid line all the way to present. RVA, see a bunch of dots here. They most likely come from Villabruna or Villabruna-related people in Italy because we find old RVA8 samples there. We also find it in Eastern Europe as well, within the Balkans. High be praised, I just said that. No, they haven't found ancient samples. They're using modern population density and saying, hey, you can't say that EM2, we're going to get into it, is restricted to sub-Saharan Africa because you have EM2 north of the Sahara and below the Sahara. And their cladal relations make them come to this conclusion, which we're going to get to here in a minute, brother. Just be patient. All right, so I'm just explaining this graph. All right, so the purple is RVA8, the light blue is EM78, North African. Green is EM2, A3, M13 is a brownish color, right? As we're going to see here. All right, so when we go down to part B, image B, you see EM2, A3, M13 represented by this brownish gold color here, EM78, blue, RV8, the purple, or violet, or what have you. They were all in this northern region of Africa at one point of time. That's what the paper is illustrating. And then the arrows are showing you the direction that they believe they came from. So they believe EM78 may have came from the Near East. Also, they believe EM2 may have came from Eastern Africa, which is this is a common hypothesis. There's no evidence of this. It's a common hypothesis that they came from Eastern Africa up into North Africa, developed there. And then after the desiccation or the drying of the Sahara, these groups break away and go south and north. Okay? As the next image is going to show. As you guys see, the green arrows are the E1B1A clades. They're going southwards and northwards. And the reason why they show this imagery, I haven't flipped back, man. I'm so sorry. Hold on. Let me share this tab and see it. Let me go back up. So what I was showing you earlier was the four groups that were in North Sahara. As you can see, M78 represented by blue, RVA8 represented by purple, A3M13 represented by like goldish brown color, and EM2, which is green. As you can see, the arrows represent the point of their antecedents coming from East Africa. A3M13, EM2 is said to come from East Africa. And then RVA8, EM78 is said to come from the Levantine corridor, Near East. So when you go here, people they aggregate here in North Africa. They develop in North Africa. Then as North Africa desiccates and it dries, the Sahara dries, you see these people spread out northwards and southwards. And as you can see, the green, which is EM2 or E1B1A, they go south and north. As you can see, you see the green arrow going towards Egypt, this region here, going up here to the Mediterranean coast, so on and so forth, right? You can see here in the Sahelian region, you see all the 4 different major Y-DNA group of men here. You see RVA8, you see EM78, which is E1B1B. You see A3M13. You also see EM2. You also see it here in Central Africa as well. These are present day populations. As we read below, the brown area is the spread of these haplogroups during the desiccation or the drying of the Sahara, and then the surrounding areas is the results of that in modern, or the impact of that in modern populations. It says a simplified Y chromosomal phylogeny and infer past or observed present day distributions of relevant Y chromosomal lineages. A is a calibrated phylogenetic tree of Y chromosomal lineages discussed in the text. Green shading represents the period when the present-day Sahara Desert was green and fertile. Lineages represented by field pentagons have undergone very rapid expansions. So as you can see, when you go up, pentagons, boom, these are pentagons, right? That says it's a rapid expansion. EM2 exploded during the bond 2 expansion, as you can see here. And you do have a downstream branch, EM183, that exploded within very recent times, 2,000 to 3,000 years. And RV8 having a huge explosion here as well. That's what those pentagons represent. So here, B, the Green Sahara period 5 to 12,000 years ago, green shading indicates that the present-day Sahara Desert was green and fertile. The colors within the large oval represent the 4 Y chromosomal haplogroups deduced to be present in the region at this time. So in North Africa, according to this paper, you would have a culmination of all 4 of these haplogroups living in this region. Okay. It says specific locations are not implied. The arrows indicate the inferred origins of these haplogroups to the north or to the south, but specific origins and routes are not implied. So, like I said, the arrows that you see here, the common belief is E1B1A comes from East Africa. So they're saying the antecedents of E1B1A came from East Africa into North Africa. It says the present-day distribution of the 4 green Saharan Y chromosomal haplogroups. This is map C. Yellow shading indicates the Sahara Desert. Each circle represents sample populations, which presence of or absence of the 4 green Saharan haplogroups shown by the colored sectors. Other haplogroups may also be present in these populations, but are not shown. The small arrows indicate the inferred northward and southward movements of these haplogroups when the Sahara became uninhabitable. So again, once the Sahara became uninhabitable, it became the desert that we know it today, or started to have the beginning stages of that. You start to see these people spread out, and they go north and south. And this is what E1B1A did as well. It says here, the authors have stated their findings by genotyping 142 informative SNPs, many newly discovered in this study, and 7,955 additional men from 145 African, Eurasian, and African American populations. This enabled them to better understand both the likely origins of the 4 haplogroups earlier than 12,000 years ago and the location of present-day descendants. And EM78 and RV8 probably originated from the north because the most closely related lineages was found there, and AM13, EM2 from the south. So that explains how they came to the conclusion when they drew these arrows here based off modern populations. It says there are some caveats to the conclusion. For example, the authors used their own estimate of the mutation rate, which happened to be slightly slower than the commonly used one, leading to a slight difference in time estimation that needs to be taken into account when comparing with other estimates. So their estimates of ages are older because it's slower. If it's faster, it's going to be younger, right? Again, these are just estimates. If you tweak some of the parameters, you're going to get different results. They went with a slower mutation rate, which results in older ages, right? It says, nevertheless, the lineage distribution and their fit with the time of the Green Sahara are very robust. How do these conclusions fit within a broader context? Insights from the Green Saharan Y chromosomal findings. It is widely accepted that sub-Saharan Y chromosomes are dominated by EM2 lineages carried by Bantu-speaking farmers as they expanded from West Africa starting 5,000 years ago, less than 5,000 years ago, reaching South Africa within recent centuries. The EM2 Bantu lineages lie phylogenetically within the EM2 Green Sahara lineage, show at least 3 explosive lineages expansions, beginning 4.9 between 5.3 thousand years ago. These events of EM2 expansion are slightly later than the RVA8 expansions and highlight the range of male demographic changes in the mid-Holocene. North of the Sahara, in addition to the 4 trans-Saharan haplogroups, haplogroup EM81, which diverged from EM78 approximately 13,000 years ago, became very common in present-day populations as a result of another massive expansion approximately 2,000 years ago. Although Y chromosomes exist within populations and so share and reflect the general history of those populations, they can sometimes show some departures from other parts of the genome that results from differences in male and female behaviors. D'Atanasio et al. Highlight one such contrast in their study. Present-day North African populations show substantial sub-Saharan autosomal and mtDNA genetic components ascribed to the Roman and Arab slave trades 1 to 2,000 years ago, but carry few sub-Saharan Y lineages from this source, probably reflecting the smaller numbers of male slaves and their reduced reproductive opportunities when compared to those of female slaves. So again, anybody know about the history of these slave trades, the Arab slave trade in particular? They would castrate their male slaves. So if you have a castrated slave, he's not doing what? He's not having sex and he's not reproducing. So he's not going to have a lineage. Right? He's not gonna leave a progeny. All right. It says here the sub-Saharan Y chromosomes in North African populations thus originate predominantly from the earlier Green Saharan period. So say, wait a minute, these groups that we attribute to sub-Saharan Africans must have been in North Africa earlier, because we know this could not have been a result of the Arab and Roman slave trades, because those people were known to mainly take females, and when they did take males, they castrated them and created them into eunuchs, so they would not leave behind a progeny. So these groups that we see in North Africa today must descend from an earlier group that started in North Africa, started to diverge in North Africa. Okay? It says here, in this part of Africa, the indigenous languages that are spoken belong to 3 of the 4 African linguistic families: Afro-Asiatic, Nilo-Saharan, and Niger-Congo. Interestingly, these languages show non-random associations with Y lineages. For example, Chadic languages within the Afro-Asiatic family are associated with haplogroup RVA8, whereas Nilo-Saharan languages are associated with specific sublineages within A3, M13, and EM78, further illustrating the complex human history of the region. Perspectives. Ancient DNA studies usually show the human past was much more complicated than can be inferred from studies of the DNA in present-day populations. So this is why we need more ancient DNA. More ancient DNA is good. This is why the Shumlaka remains study was so powerful, because it showed and illustrated that when you go to these old regions like in Cameroon and Shumlaka, you can only see these hunter-gatherers there. That's the only proof we have. These hunter-gatherers, these A and B markers, really don't even see EM2 there. And that's from 8,000 and then 3,000 years ago. You still don't see EM2. You still don't see E1B1A. Right? It says here, with the demonstration of successful recovery and analysis of ancient African DNA as old as approximately 8,000 years ago from Malawi and greater than 2,000 years ago from Egypt, it seems that the ancient DNA may be recoverable more widely from Africa, and thus can inform us more directly about Y chromosomal history and population movements during the Green Sahara period. The current study raises many questions that remains to be addressed. For example, what are the reasons for the very rapid RVA8 expansion 5 to 6,000 years ago and EM81 expansion approximately 2,000 years ago? And how do these expansions fit within the general worldwide patterns of male-specific expansions, which in other cases have been linked to cultural and technological changes? And that's the end of this paper here. So here, we're going to leave this paper and we're going to transition to the peopling of the last Green Sahara revealed by high coverage resequencing of trans-Saharan patrilineages. And again, this is the paper that was being quoted in the last paper by they were quoting Atanasio and others, right? As you can see, this was published in February 12, 2018. Abstract, again, abstract is always a summation of the paper. It said little is known about the peopling of the Sahara during the Holocene climatic optimum, when the desert was replaced by a fertile environment. Results: in order to investigate the role of the last Green Sahara in the peopling of Africa, we deep sequence the whole non-repetitive portion of the Y chromosome in 104 males selected as representative haplogroups, which are currently found to the north and to the south of the Sahara. So they're using minor populations and then drawing inferences from that. We identified 5,966 mutations, from which we extract 142 informative markers when genotyped in about 8,000 subjects from 145 African, Eurasian, and African American populations. We find that the correlation in the age of the trans-Saharan haplogroups dates back to the last Green Sahara, while most Northern African or Sub-Saharan African clades expanded locally in the subsequent arid phase. So that's huge right there. Conclusions. Our findings suggested that Green Sahara promoted human movements and demographic expansions, possibly linked to the adoption of pastoralism. Comparing our results with previously reported genome-wide data, we also find evidence for a sex-biased sub-Saharan contribution to Northern Africans, suggesting that historical events such as trans-Saharan slave trade mainly contributed to the mtDNA and autosomal gene pool, whereas the Northern African paternal gene pool was mainly shaped by more ancient events. Again, so if you see E1B1A in the north, that's because it was something ancient that occurred. Something ancient that occurred. The mtDNA, on the other hand, can be attributed to the trans-Saharan slave trade of the Arabs and Romans, not the male side. That's what the paper is saying. And also the spread of, when you start seeing population booms, you start seeing pastoralism. Because again, you need pastoralism, you need an agrarian lifestyle to sustain larger populations. This is why EM2, E1B1A was so dominant, because they brought in farming. They had the farmers package, the agrarian package. They were able to eat better, have more energy, and able to support larger populations. Background states the Sahara Desert is the widest hot desert on Earth and covers about 1/3 of the African continent, from the Atlantic coast to the Red Sea. Over the past millennia, the Sahara underwent strong climatic fluctuations, alternating arid and humid phases. During the humid phase periods, referred to as Green Sahara or African humid periods, the landscape was characterized by the presence of the savanna forests and an extensive system of rivers and lakes. A large amount of paleoecological and paleoanthropological evidence indicates that the fertile environment probably enabled the occupation of the Saharan area by fauna and hominids since the Miocene. Most recent Green Sahara period occurred in the Holocene, in a time frame from about 12,000 years ago to about 5,000 years ago. This phase has been denominated the Holocene climatic optimum and is most well-documented past climatic change. Human settlement across the Sahara in this period is testified by archaeological evidence such as rock engravings, lithic and bone tools, and pottery. Like some of these rock engravings depict like hippopotamus. Like you wouldn't have a hippopotamus in a region that's dry or deserted. Hippopotamus would be in regions that are wet. They have to spend majority of their life in water. So that's just more evidence that this used to be a wet savanna with forests and rivers and lakes. Says human settlement across the Sahara in this period is testified by archaeological evidence such as rock engravings, lithic and bone tools, and pottery. After the African humid period, the climatic conditions became rapidly hyper-arid, and the green Sahara was replaced by the desert, which acted as a strong geographic barrier against human movements between northern and sub-Saharan Africa. A consequence of this is that there is strong differentiation in the Y chromosome haplogroup composition between the northern and sub-Saharan regions of the African continent. In the northern area, the predominant Y lineages are JM267 and EM81. And we know JM267 is a trans-Caucasian lineage that migrates down into the Levant during the Bronze Age. And then about 3,000 years ago, they migrate down into northern and East Africa. A lot of northern and East Africans are downstream clades of JM267 and also JP58, which is, according to popular media, the Jewish haplotype or Kohen monohaplotype comes from that, right? It says here, Y lineages are JM267 and EM81, with the former being linked to the Neolithic expansions in the Near East, and the latter reaching frequencies as high as 80% in some northwestern populations as consequences of a very recent local demographic expansion. So E1B1B started to dominate North Africa very recently, about 2,000 to 3,000 years, somewhere around that range. That's when they started having their own population explosion, where they began to pretty much have the lion's share of male lineages in North Africa. On the contrary, sub-Saharan Africa is characterized by a completely different genetic landscape, with lineages within EM2 and haplogroup B comprising most of the Y chromosomes. In most regions of sub-Saharan Africa, the observed haplogroup distribution has been linked to the recent, approximately 3,000 years ago, demic diffusion of the Bantu agriculturalists. And as we've seen, these Bantus are Northern African related. Let me go back to the other map from the other paper that we read. From the paper, A History of Male Migration in and Out of the Green Sahara. So if we go here, you can see that the Bantus branch off from the E1B1A carriers that came from North Africa. You guys see that? They branch off here and they explode. These pentagons represent explosions, population explosions. Again, the reason why they explode because they understood agrarian lifestyle. They had agrarian package. They're able to farm their food. They don't have to hunt their food, which makes a big difference, especially in the ancient world. So let's go back to the paper. Again, this probably happened about 3,000 years ago, about 1,000 BCE, somewhere around that, give or take. And we know this because when you look at a lot of the equatorial African regions, they were not even inhabited. There's no proof of human inhabitants until like 2,500 years ago. That's 500 BCE or 2,700 years ago. You know, that's 700 BCE. So you don't see people really moving in there because a lot of it was forested. So what you need to do is deforestation to even migrate through that region. You have to have that ability, which we talked about in other shows about the secular understanding of E1B1A. We covered the papers. You have to have some ability to deforest. And the best way to deforest is iron technology, which the Bantus, they had access to, they had knowledge of, right? Which was alien to sub-Saharan Africa, letting you know that these guys come from more northern regions. Anyway, it says here, the observed haplogroup distribution has been linked to the recent 3,000 years ago demic diffusion of Bantu agriculturalists, which brought the EM2 subclades from Central Africa to East and to South. On the contrary, the sub-Saharan distribution of BM150 seems to have more ancient origins. See, the original sub-Saharan Africans were not EM2. Most likely were A and B carriers, and as we can see, they're talking about BM150, which we speak about the pygmies and the forest bush people. They have a more ancient origin in this region. It says, since its eternal lineages are present both in Bantu farmers and non-Bantu hunter-gatherers, and correlates long before the Bantu expansion. In spite of their genetic differentiation, however, northern and sub-Saharan Africans share at least 4 patrilineages at different frequencies, namely A3M13, EM2, which is E1B1A, EM78, downstream of E1B1B, YAP, and RV88. So you find these lineages in north of the Sahara and south of the Sahara, right? It says A3M13 is typical of Eastern Africa, where it's found with a frequency as high as 40% and is prevalent in the Nilo-Saharan populations, in particular among Nilotic pastoralists. A3M13 chromosomes have also been observed in Central and Northern Africa at frequencies ranging from 1 to 7%. Outside of Africa, this haplogroup has been found at very low frequencies, both in the Middle East and Sardinia. It says, as described above, EM2 is a sub-Saharan clade which has been often associated with the Bantu expansion. However, EM2 chromosomes have also been found at low frequencies between 2 and 10% in northern Africa. EM78 is a widespread lineage with significant frequencies in Africa, Europe, and in the Middle East. Within the African continent, 3 EM78 subclades, EV22, EV12, and EV264, show different frequencies in different regions. EV22 is mainly an East African subhaplogroup with frequencies of more than 80% in the Sahel population from Eritrea, but it has also been reported in Egypt and Morocco. EV12 is relatively frequent in northern and eastern Africa, but it has also been reported outside of Africa at lower frequencies. The vast majority of the Eastern African EV12 chromosomes belong to the internal clade of EV32, which has also been observed in northern and central Africa at low frequencies. EV264 is subdivided into two subclades, EV65, common in northern Africa, and EV259, which includes few Central African chromosomes. RVA8 has also been observed at high frequencies in the Central Sahel, northern Cameroon, northern Nigeria, Chad, and Niger. And it has also been reported at low frequencies in northwestern Africa. Outside the African continent, two rare RV8 sublineages, RM18 and RV35, have been observed in the Near East and Southern Europe, particularly in Sardinia. Because of its ethnogeographic distribution in the Central Sahel, RVA8 has been linked to the spread of the Chadic branch of the Afro-Asiatic linguistic family. From a genetic point of view, the use of variability in the present-day male-specific portion of the human Y chromosome to infer past population dynamics across the Sahara is complicated by two major factors. The onset of the hyper-arid conditions caused the depopulation of the Sahara. The regions immediately northward and southward of the Sahara have experienced extensive demographic expansions after the African humid period, which have led to the increase in frequencies of different Y haplogroups, partially concealing the pre-existing genetic composition. And this is what was brought up this week. Some people say, well, you don't have that many carriers in a certain region. That just means the other carriers were more dominant, more successful reproducers, or the other carriers did not compete well, you understand? And they weren't able to reproduce as much. That's all that means. It does not tell you the origin of where these groups come from. It just says, hey, one was more of a successful lineage than the other. And that can conceal the pre-existing genetic composition. Case in point, you have Transcaucasian people coming into the Levant today. They have the lion's share of males in that region, but that does not mean they originate in that region. We know they come from the Transcaucasian region, right? So higher frequencies and lower frequencies does not tell you origin points. Anyway, let's keep reading. In this context, rare Y lineages with a relic geographic distribution can be highly informative regarding human migrations across the Sahara. Thus, considering their frequency distribution, the four trans-Saharan lineages A3M13, EM2, EM78, and RVA8 could represent the remains of the Saharan male-specific Y genetic landscape before the desertification, contrary to the usual interpretation involving recent gene flow events such as the trans-Saharan Arab slave trade. Again, to recapitulate, the Arab slave trade was a sex-biased migration, meaning it was mostly females that were involved, and when males were involved, they were normally castrated, so they were not able to leave a progeny. It says, in order to investigate the role of the last green Sahara in the peopling of Africa, we performed targeted next-generation sequencing. of approximately 3.3 MB of 104 Y chromosomes, mostly belonging to these four lineages. We also analyzed the geographic distribution of 142 informative single nucleotide polymorphism (SNPs) by genotyping about 8,000 male subjects from 145 worldwide populations, including 17 populations from literature, with a particular focus on the African ethnic groups. Our findings were consistent with the hypothesis that the Green Sahara allowed extensive human movements, excluding recent historical events such as the Arab slave trade, as a major determinant of the male gene pool of the present-day northern African populations. It says phylogenetic tree and the four trans-Saharan clades. For the phylogenetic tree reconstruction and time estimates, we use 150 Y chromosomes. The samples were analyzed for approximately 3.3 MB of the extra-generated portion of the MSY and belong to different data sets. 104 Y chromosomes from our lab collection, 77 of them belong to four trans-Saharan haplogroups, and 46 publicly available high-cover sequences, including four previously radiocarbon dated ancient specimens as calibration points. Here's the table here. It says regions of the MSY selected for the target next generation sequencing. The human Y chromosome. The B targets the blocks of the extra-degenerate portion of the MSY analyzed in this study. The exact coordinates on the Y chromosome are reported in the additional file. Table S6 and the description of the selection criteria is reported by the method section. C is the Y chromosome ruler calibrated on the February 2009 assembly. All right, moving on. As in a set of 104 samples from our lab collection, we identified 5,966 SNPs. Interestingly, 3,044 variants, 51% out of the 5,966 were not reported in previous studies. So this is all novel. A lot of the stuff they found in the study is novel, new. And that's going to be key because we're going to get to a particular map here that's going to be eye-opening. It says, and this figure is significantly greater than that reported by Halas et al., despite the fact that experimental approaches were similar, and the number of sequence samples by Halas and colleagues was about 4 times higher. After the inclusion of 46 samples from the literature, the total number of variants increased to 7,544. We used all 7,544 SNPs in a whole set of 150 subjects to reconstruct a maximum parsimony tree, which was found to be coherent with the recently published worldwide Y phylogenies. And here's the chart I wanted to get to. As you can see, most of the world branches off. They're not the same as A. See, a lot of people think we're the same as A00 and all that. No, we're not. We branch off from that, branch off again, and branch off again until we get to DE. A whole different separate branch, separate group of humans create these different lineages. All right. But I want to show you something. Let me see if I can blow this up. You see this color code down to the bottom left? It tells you what region these clades are associated with. So Northeast African is like a darker blue, like a navy blue, okay? And Northwestern African is like a lighter blue. So when we go to the EM2 section, let me blow this up. As a matter of fact, let me do this. Full size image. And let's see. Hopefully you guys can see that. So when we get to the EM2 branch here, E1B1A, remember navy blue is Northwest African and light blue, I believe, is Northeastern African. Let me see. Let me make sure. No, I had it reversed. Navy blue is Northeastern African and light blue is Northwest African. As you can see, S148, the branch here, is Northwest African because it's lighter blue. And then you also have navy blue. Oh, we are EM78, excuse me. You also have navy blue clades. And all of these clades are EM2 ancestral. Ancestral EM2. And you have Northwestern, which is lighter blue, and Northeastern African clades associated with ancestral clades. This is why they go to the conclusion that EM2 has its origin. Like the Bantus have their origin, their antecedents come from North Africa because these ancestral clades, it's a star on the end of the clade, denotes ancestral, right? The ancestral clades, the first clades, are associated with northwestern Africa and northeastern Africa. Again, go to the graph. Northwestern Africa is the lighter blue colors. Northeastern Africa is the darker blue, which is like a navy blue. We go back to EM2. This is all the ancestral EM2. You have 3 that are northwestern, and I believe 4 that are northeastern. As you guys can see, the S166 clade, S163, S164, S165, S170, S168, and S167. Majority of these ancestral EM2 clades are, in fact, northwestern and northeastern specific. So why are the older clades mainly focused with mainly pointing towards a northeastern, northwestern African distribution? It's because these older EM2 groups were there. It's just that simple. That's the inference being drawn from here. As you can see, again, that's the color code. And we have another northwestern, I believe. Hold on, let me go here. There's another northwestern one here, down here. That's also S169, which is also an EM2 or E1B1A ancestral clade, as you can see. So, I mean, it's evident here. One of them is Western Africa, this one here that comes off branch 78. And the orange represents Central Sahel. So you have a Central Sahel and Western African one, but it is majorly dominated by Northwestern and Northeastern clades, as we see here. Anyway, so I want to point that out. Interesting here that the gray denotes a mixture, so a mixture of northern and southern, sub-Saharan African is U174. U181 is a mixture, and U290, that's my clade, is also known as a mixture. So they see it in multiple places. So you guys can check this out on your own, but I found that very telling, very interesting, just like the other paper was revealing that there are certain clades associated with Palestine that was E1B1A. All right. All right. So let's go back. So this is a maximum parsimony Y chromosome tree in the dating of the 4 trans-Saharan haplogroups. Phylogenetic relations among 150 samples analyzed here. Each haplogroup is labeled in a different color. The 4 Y sequences from the ancient samples are marked by the dagger symbol. Phylogenetic tree of the 4 trans-Saharan haplogroups aligned to the timeline at the bottom. At the tip of each lineage, the ethnogeographic affiliation of the corresponding sample is represented by a circle colored by, according to the legend, bottom left. The last green Sahara period is highlighted by a green belt in the background. So let me just show that real quick. This is the green belt, right, that they're talking about. All of these groups come from the green Sahara and diverge from the green Sahara. And they approximate this to be what, about 11 to 10,000 years ago. Remember, the oldest Homo sapien skeletal remain we find in ancient sub-Saharan Western Africa is 12,000 years ago. This is before that. But this starts about 11 and 10. We have a more northern distribution. And the reason why many people want to neglect that, because once you start putting U1B1A in the north, you connect them to the Levant and Eurasia, because there are no genetic boundaries. This is why we found 3 EM2 groups that are associated with a Palestinian origin. And one with the Egyptian. It's just that simple. All right. Back to the article. All right. You see why we rather push empirical data instead of streaming Deuteronomy 28 all day? Let's start interpreting facts instead of using eisegesis as our main impetus to convey our messages. Anyway, it says here, by calibration with the 4 archaeological dated specimens, we obtain a mutation rate, and it's this mutation rate here, which is consistent with previously published estimates and which was used to obtain an accurate estimate of correlation ages of the tree nodes, which are particularly focused on the 4 trans-Saharan clades. We'll obtain the time estimates using 2 different approaches, the row statistics and the beast method. We perform 2 different beast runs on a strict or relaxed clock, respectively. The obtained point values were found to be highly concordant, as previously observed. For this reason, hereafter, we only report and discuss time estimates based on the row statistics. And they give you a table for that. We're going to keep going on. I want this video to be rewatchable, so let's finish this. It says a 3M13 phylogeny is characterized by a first bifurcation separating branches 19 and 37 about 10.75 thousand years ago. Interestingly, branch 19 has a widespread distribution, harboring lineages from within and outside the African continent. So you have acarriers in the Near East, you have acarriers in Greece, mainland Greece, you have in the Aegean region, you have acarriers in Britain. Let you know that you had a wider distribution of these Paleo-Africans were wider distributed in the past, right? The dispersal was far-reaching. It's not limited to sub-Saharan Africa either, right? And it says it dated to about 10.24 thousand years ago, suggesting a role of the humid period in the diffusion of this clade. On the contrary, branch 37 only includes samples from the Horn of Africa, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Djibouti, and Somalia, and is dated to about 8.43 thousand years ago. The topology of EM2 is characterized by a main multiplication downstream to branch 71, dating back to the beginning of the Green Sahara, 10.53 thousand years ago, and including all the deep sequence samples except one, branch 70. So again, remember I showed you all those ancestral clades and where they were coming, or they're going back to. We're going back to Northwest and Northeastern specific groups. It says consistent with the tree report in phase 3 of the 1,000 Genomes Project. However, we found 11 clades, branches 72, 73, 74, 75, 76, 79, 81, 82, 95, 98, 99, which share no markers with the 262 EM2 chromosomes analyzed by Posnick and colleagues. It is worth noting that branches 72 and 81 are 2 deep sister lineages. Here you go. This is what I was pointing out within the EM2 main multiplication, and both of them include chromosomes from Northern Africa. Northern Africa. It is worth noting the branches 72 and 81 are 2 deep sister lineages, like they're very ancestral, right? The EM2 main multiplication, and both of them include chromosomes from Northern Africa. This is why this map shows you. Let's go back here. It shows you the multiplication of EM2 during the Green Sahara in North Africa. And then the downstream markers, the progeny of those people are here, the Bantus. So you start off in North Africa, develop different branches of E1, B1A, and then one of those branches break out into the Bantu clades. That's what the evidence is pointing towards. So again, ISOG was correct in saying this. E1B1A is an African lineage that probably expanded from Northern Africa to Sub-Saharan and Equatorial Africa with the Bantu agricultural expansion. That's a very reasonable conclusion. So let's go back. It is worth noting that branches 72 and 81 are 2 deep sister lineages within the EM2 main multiplication, and both of them include chromosomes from Northern Africa. Similarly, the other terminal lineages absent in the 1,000 Genomes Project tree are mainly represented by samples from Northern Africa, or to a lesser extent, from the northernmost regions of Sub-Saharan Africa. It's clear, man. They're coming from the northern direction and then going south. The more ancestral clades are in the north. and then making their way to the south. It says the phylogenetic structure EM78 has been resolved in a recent study. However, we were obtained further information about the relationships within the EV12 subclade. The former EV12 chromosomes form a monophyletic cluster, branch 125, dated to 9,000 years ago, and a sister to EV32, which in turn is further subdivided into three sister clades, branches 132, 138, and 143. While branches 132 and 138 have been found in Eastern Africa, where EV32 is more frequent, branch 143 only includes samples from Central Sahel. Finally, RVA8 lineages date back to 7.85 thousand years ago, and its main internal branch, branch 233, forms a star-like topology suggestive of a demographic expansion. More specifically, 18 out of the 21 sequence chromosomes belong to branch 233, which includes 8 sister clades, 5 of which are represented by a single subject. The correlation's age of the sub-branch dates back to 5.73 thousand years ago, during the last Green Sahara period. Interestingly, the subject included in the star-like structure comes from northern Africa or central Sahel, tracing a trans-Saharan axis. It's worth noting that even the three lineages outside the main multiplication, branches 230, 231, and 232, are sister lineages without any nested substructure. The peculiar topology of RVA8 sequence samples suggests that the diffusion of this haplogroup was quite rapid and possibly triggered by the Saharan favorable climate. In other words, as the Sahara became a desert, they wanted to move to a more favorable climate in the Sahelian regions. It says, and in general, our NGS results and time estimates show that the large majority of lineages shared by Northern Africans and Sub-Saharan Africans coalesced during the last green period. Lamest terms, they come from the Green Sahara. Conversely, after 5,000 years ago, we mainly found lineages restricted to either northern or sub-Saharan regions, with a few exceptions. So when you see E1B1A in the north, E1B1A in the south, they coalesce in the Green Sahara. They were once one coagulated, right, aggregated, and then they broke off, branched off, and as the Sahara becomes a desert, they spread out northwards and southwards. Population analysis of the 4 trans-Saharan clades. In order to gain more information about the ethnogeographic distribution of the 4 trans-Saharan haplogroups, we selected 142 informative markers belonging to these lineages and analyzed them in a wider sample composed of 7,955 males from 145 worldwide populations. It is worth noting that 96 ethnic groups come from different African regions, allowing us to obtain a detailed picture of genetic variability of the 4 haplogroups across the Sahara. And you have the A markers showing their distribution. They're in Saharan regions today. They're in southeastern regions, Saharan regions. E1B1A is pretty much lion's share of sub-Saharan Africa, Western, but you can also see them in the Saharan regions as well. These are certain clades, EU209, more Western and Central African, the EM191, Central African specific, EZ15939, we see Saharan and on the western coast, north end sub-Saharan African regions as well. And then our Yap brothers, E1B1A, M78, they have a northern distribution, a Horn of African distribution. The EV22 is mostly concentrated in Egypt and the Horn of Africa. Mainly, most of them are Horn of African. As you can see, EV12 and the EV264 is mainly northern African. The RVA8, Central African, primarily RV1589, primarily Central African again, as you can see in Egypt and leaking over into Libya. Then you have RV4759, which has some blotches in the western coast of Africa and some blotches here in the northwest regions. Then RV69 is in Egypt and some regions in Central Africa as well. And it tells you here time estimates and frequency maps of the four trans-Saharan haplogroups and major subclades, time estimates of four trans-Saharan clades, and the main internal lineages to the left of the timeline. The time windows of main climatic historical African events are reported in different colors. Frequency maps of the main trans-Saharan clades and subclades for each map and relative frequency percentages are reported to the right. And as you can see, that green bar is the green Sahara. And with that green bar, you see all these clades converging, right? They're all in the same region. E1B1A, um, RVA8, A3M13, and EM70. They're all there. The Bantu expansion, you can see EM191, E1B1A, RVA8, RV479 around that region. And then they have the Arab slave trade, which is much more recent, which they don't attribute any male-specific Y chromosomes to. Because again, to recapitulate, the Arab slave trade was sex biased. It mainly sold and traded females, and when they did have males, they castrated them and created them to eunuchs. Therefore, they can't leave. They can't pass the Y chromosome. And then above here, if the earlier ones here with the EM2, EM78, RV8, RV 268 on the timeline. Let's go down. Figure 4. Map of the populations analyzed. Geographic positions of population from Africa, Southern Europe, and Near East are shown. And that's basically what this map is showing, where they analyze the populations to come to their conclusions. You can see there's Near Eastern populations, European, Horn of African populations, Western Central African populations, Northwestern African populations, so on and so forth. It says we also included 8 ethnic populations from America whose genetic variations have been shaped by the transatlantic slave trade, 15th to the 19th century, to be used as positive control to investigate the effects of other recent historical events, such as the Arab slave trade from the 7th to the 19th centuries, which involved the forced movement of millions of sub-Saharan Africans toward Northern Africa. Because remember, that's mainly the argument when we start bringing up Y chromosomes like E1B1A and other sub-Saharan African groups in the North African context, then they want to say, okay, slavery did that. But this paper is refuting that. It says the genotyping results of A3M13 confirm this very high geographic differentiation, with most lineages restricted to one geographic area. There are a few exceptions to this general pattern. A3V2742, A3V2816, A3V3800, which were found in 2 different regions, usually belonging to the same geographical macro area. While A3V1018 is restricted to the Horn of Africa, its sister clade A3V5912 is more widespread, arriving as far as southern Europe, more specifically Sardinia. As we did find that A clade that was on that island that famously was burnt by a volcano, right? In like 2,000 years ago, we found an A clade there. It says most of the Mediterranean lineages correlates with sub-Saharan clades in a time window between 10,000 and 6.45 thousand years ago, where the upper and lower limit are correlation ages of A3V5912 and A3V2336, respectively. During the last human phase of the Sahara, 12 to 5,000 years ago, after this period, the lineages are restricted to sub-Saharan Africa or Northern Africa. It is worth noting that A3V4735 has been found both in Central Sahel and in the Great Lakes region, Kenya and Uganda, and Eastern Africa, suggesting a movement along the Sahelian belt starting during the final period of the last Green Sahara, 6.02 to 5.30 thousand years ago. It is known that the geographic distribution of EM2 in sub-Saharan Africa has been heavily influenced by the recent, less than 3,000 years ago, Bantu expansion. And this is mirrored by the high frequencies of several EM2 subclades among the Bantu people, in particular EU290 and EU174. Yeah. It says, however, we found clues as the role As to the role of the last Green Sahara, considering the phylogeography of the EM2 subclades in northern Africa, the correlation age of the lineages harboring northern and sub-Saharan chromosomes predates the onset of the era conditions, falling between 11.03 thousand years ago, correlation age of E, page 66, and 4.49 thousand years ago, the time estimate of the most recent clade harboring a relevant proportion of Northern African samples, i.e. V5280. During the last Green Sahara, after this same time frame, we observed clades restricted to the north or to the south of the Sahara. In this context, although the large majority of the geographical restricted lineages come from the sub-Saharan regions, we also found two northern African-specific clades, namely EV5001 and EV4990. EV5001 has only been found in Egypt. It's one of the sister clades within the EM4727 multiplication. It correlates at 3.88 thousand years ago. EV4990 is a Moroccan clade dated to 4.49 thousand years ago, the time estimate of the upstream node. Interestingly, it is the terminal branch of a nested topology which divides Western Africa from Morocco. We found a relevant proportion, approximately 22% of African American subjects belonging to the EM2 haplogroup. These groups have been heavily influenced by the Atlantic slave trade, which took place between 15th and 19th centuries, and of which the source population was mainly sub-Saharan people, consistent with the autosomal data. These subjects have been found to be very similar to the source African populations in their EM2 haplogroup composition. So approximately 22% of the African American subjects belong to the EM2 haplogroup. I believe it's talking about this Northwestern group as well, if I'm reading this correctly, if I'm interpreting correctly. The distribution and age estimates of different EM78 subhaplogroups show a strong parallelism, excluding the EV13 subclade, which has been linked to Neolithic transition in the Near East. All other three major EM78 lineages, EV264, EV22, and EV12, including Mediterranean clade harboring Northern African, Near Eastern, and Southern European samples, and a sub-Saharan clade. The age estimates of the nodes joining the lineages from these two macro areas are quite concordant. 12.30 thousand years ago for EV264, 11.01 thousand years ago for EV22, and 10.01 thousand years ago for EV12, and correspond to the beginning of the humid phase in the Eastern Sahara, whereas EM78 probably originated. After the end of the last Green Sahara, approximately 5,000 years ago, the differentiation is sharp with no lineages, including both Mediterranean and sub-Saharan subjects. Sub-Saharan E-clades V264, V259, and EV22, V3262 are restricted to the Central Sahel and Eastern Africa, mainly the Horn of Africa, respectively. Whereas EV12, V32 is frequent in Eastern Africa, but also includes a Central Sahelian clade, suggesting a Sahelian movement between 5.99 and 5.17 thousand years ago. The genotyping of RVA8 internal markers disclosed the phylogenetic relationship of two rare European subclades, RM18 and RV35, with respect to the African-specific clades. The presence of two nested RVA8 basal European clades can be related to high frequencies of RVA8 internal lineages in the Central Sahel, assuming a movement from Europe toward the Central Sahel across Northern Africa. So again, these people would ultimately get their ancestry from European males that came in around this time via Northern Africa and then into the Central Sahel. That's where the Chadic people come from. Ultimately, they descend from Europeans. In turn, considering the trans-Saharan distribution and star-like topology of the subclade RV1589 branch 233, it is likely that this lineage rapidly expanded into the Lake Chad area between 5.73 and 5.5 thousand years ago. So this is about between 3,000 and 4,000 BCE, and moved backward to northeastern Africa across the Saharan region. The large majority of RV1589 internal lineages harbors both northern and central Sahelian subjects, with the exceptions of RV4759 and 5781, which are mainly restricted to northern Africa and central Sahel, respectively. The presence of a precisely dated and geographically restricted clade RV 4759 in northern Africa allowed us to define its correlation to age to 4.69 thousand years ago as the lower limit for the backwards RV8 trans-Saharan movement. Now, let's get beyond the last Green Sahara. Although the focus of this present study was to understand the African population dynamics linked to the last Green Sahara period, we also found evidence of other movements within and outside Africa involving different ethnic groups that occurred before or after the Holocene climatic optimum. The Saharan belt spans from the Atlantic Ocean to the Red Sea, immediately south of the Sahara. Its climate and ecology are intermediate between desert, typically of the Sahara to the north, and the tropical savanna, typical of the regions of the south. In this area, several languages belonging to three of the four African linguistic families, i.e., Afro-Asiatic, Nilo-Saharan, and Niger-Congo, are spoken, confirming that the Sahel has been an important crossroad in the African continent. We found evidence of Sahelian movements in at least three haplogroups: A3M13, EM2, EM78, and that's it. Yeah, those three clades. A3M13, V4735, EM78, V32 seem to have been involved in human movements that occurred in the same time window, or approximately 6 to 5,000 years ago, along the same bidirectional Sahelian axis from Lake Chad to Eastern Africa. A3M13 V4735 probably originated somewhere in the central Sahel between 10.24 and 6.02 thousand years ago, and possibly arrived in Eastern Africa after 6.02 thousand years ago. This clade is significantly related to the Nilo-Saharan speaking groups, refining previous hypotheses about the association between A3M13 and Nilo-Saharan spread from the central Sahel to Eastern Africa. In the same period, we found evidence of a movement along the same Sahelian axis involving the internal lineages of EM78, V32. This haplogroup probably differentiated in Eastern Africa 5.99 thousand years ago, and we observed a shift in its geographic distribution toward the central Sahel, where it arrived not later than 5.17 thousand years ago. Interestingly, all the central Sahelian EV32 chromosomes belong to the eternal clade EV32, which is almost exclusively found among Nilo-Saharans. These findings suggest that the Nilo-Saharan spread along the Sahelian belt was probably a complex event involving different clades and different movements from the Lake Chad Basin to Eastern Africa and back. Haplogroup EM2Z15939, whose correlation's age is approximately 7,000 years ago, falls within the last Green Sahara period, seems to have been involved in another Sahelian movement, being present at high frequencies among different Fubi groups. Interestingly, the geographic distribution of this clade perfectly traces the Fubi migration from Western Africa, where this haplogroup is also common in other ethnic groups, to the central Sahel, where the same haplogroup is only found among the Fubi populations. Outside of Africa, both A3M13 and RV88 harbor sublineages geographically restricted to the island of Sardinia, and both seem to indicate ancient trans-Mediterranean contacts. The phylogeography of A3M13 suggests that the direction of the movement was from Africa to Sardinia, while RV88 topology indicates a Europe to African migration. So again, recapitulating the point that Chadic people descend from Europeans anciently, right? And this also shows that there was movements that leaked out of Africa, as we can see. A3M13, which is associated with sub-Saharan Africans, was found in Sardinia, which is an island in the Mediterranean Sea. It says, indeed, our data suggests a European origin of RV88 about 12.3 thousand years ago, considering both the presence of two Sardinian RV88 basal clades, RM18 and RV35, and that the RV88 marker arose in the RM343 background, which in turn includes Near Eastern European lineages. It is worth noting that the arrival of RV88 in the Sahara seems to have occurred between 8.67 and 7.85 thousand years ago, considering as an upper limit the time estimates of the last node, including European specific lineage, while the lower limit is the correlation age of all of the African specific lineages. Refining the time frame of the trans-Saharan migration proposed in the previous studies, the route of RVA8 toward the Lake Chad Basin probably passed through northeastern Africa rather than Arabia, considering the absence of RVA8 in the Horn of Africa. Interestingly, both A3M13 and RV88 European subclades correlate in ancient times. Less than 7.62 thousand years ago for the A3M13 V2742, and between 12.34 and 8.67 thousand years ago for the RV8/M18 and RV8/V35. But it's possible that both clades were widespread in southern Europe, where they have been replaced by Y haplogroups brought by the following recurrent migration waves from Asia. So they believe that you had the VA8 clades and some of the A clades that had, a wider distribution than they do today in southern Europe, and also, both of them had a wider distribution in southern Europe, which is completely different than today's distribution. Again, showing that frequencies of haplogroups today don't necessarily speak to the origin of where these people were in the past. Because again, we have sub-Saharan African sub-Saharan African group A3M13 and RV8 that most likely was in these lands. And there's another paper I was reading earlier that can show that, because these are Villa-Bruno related peoples. Let me jump to this paper real quick. So this is a paper came out recently. The ancient genome-wide DNA from France highlights the complexity and interaction between Mesolithic hunter-gatherers and Neolithic farmers in 2020. And I want to go to this graph in this paper if I can get it real quick. Let's see if I can get it right here. So those blue circles to illustrate what this paper is saying. This would be your Villa-Bruno related peoples. This would include your RVA8 peoples, and also could include those AM13 groups. This is between 14,000 to 4,000 BCE. And as you can see, there's a wider distribution of those RV88 related people, or the Villa-Bruno related people that consisted of RV88. So it's not too far-fetched to see they had a wider distribution in Europe in an earlier time. All right, so back to the peopling of the Green Sahara. Now we're going to get to the discussion. The discussion states role of the Green Sahara in the distribution of the four haplogroups. The large majority of nodes joining northern and sub-Saharan patrilineage date back to the Green Saharan period. On the contrary, most clades geographically restricted to one of these two macro regions correlates after 5,000 years ago. Usually, the presence of a sub-Saharan genetic component in northern Africa is put down to the Arab slave trade, which is the 17th and 19th centuries, from the sub-Saharan regions towards the markets located along the Mediterranean coast. If this was the case, we should observe no significant differences in the sub-Saharan component of Y haplogroups between the African American and Northern African populations, since both the Atlantic and Arab slave trades are recent events which involve the same source geographic area. However, considering the distribution of EM2 sublineages in the American admix, Northern African, and Sub-Saharan African populations, we found a significant correlation between admix and Sub-Saharan groups, consistent with the genome-wide data, while Northern Africans and Sub-Saharan people were not correlated. Consistent with these findings, also Northern Africans and American admix people were found not to be correlated. But it's showing that there's a difference between the Northern and Southern African E1B1As, because the Northern E1B1As are more ancient, as we showed earlier, and the Southern are more downstream clades and branches from that more ancient E1B1A, showing that the oldest branches were in Northern Africa. Right, and here's a chart here. Ancestral EM2 is primarily Northern African because it's represented by the blue. So again, E1B1A is between 2 and 10% North Africa today. Majority of those ancestral E1B1A clades are Northern African, as we see here. So there is some intersection going on right here with EZ15939. Remember, it gives you the color code here. Let me go up. E1B1A, the blue is Northern Africa, the orange is Sub-Saharan Africa, and the gray is American admixed populations. So this clade was found in Northern Africa, American admixed populations, and Sub-Saharan Africa, the EZ15939. Also, the EU290, the clade I belong to, found in Northern Africa. That's why when we looked at the chart, they had a mix. They had a dark gray, which would represent a mixed distribution. EU290 has a Northern African, Sub-Saharan African, and American admixed branch, which I belong to, the EU290 branch. The EU174 has a Northern African, Sub-Saharan African, and admix, American admix. EU209 also has look how big of a Northern African branch it has. And a Sub-Saharan African branch and American admix. EV4990, as we read in the paper, was primarily Northern African. EA186 is primarily Northern African. EV4240, primarily Northern African, as we see here. But again, the ancestral marker, E1P1A, primarily Northern African, because that's where that's our route. Our route comes from the north then down to the south. It says relative proportions of American admixed, Sub-Saharan or Northern African Y chromosomes belonging to the EM2 subclades. Data from the nomadic populations, Tuareg and Fulbe, and from 7 lineages with an absolute frequency equal to 1 were not used for the generation of this graph. Compared to the macro region subdivision reported in additional file 1, table S5, we collapsed Northwestern African and Northwestern African macro regions into Northern African. While the Sub-Saharan African groups include Central Sahel, Western African, Central Africa, Great Lake regions, Horn of Africa, Southern Africa, and all Bantu groups in these regions. In the inset, we report the relative frequencies of the whole EM2 haplogroup in the same macro regions. Again, EM2 ancestral regions, primarily Northern African. The same pattern was also observed when only the Western Central Sahelian groups of Sub-Saharan Africa were considered. These data suggest that the presence in Northern Africa of Sub-Saharan patrilineage was not due to recent contact, was probably occurred in more ancient times, possibly during the Green Sahara period, considering the correlation ages of the clades. Our findings seems to be at odds with genome-wide studies reporting a recent relevant Sub-Saharan genetic component in modern Northern African populations, mainly attributed to the era of slave trade. This apparent discrepancy between their inferences based on Y chromosomal and autosomal DNA could be the consequence of a sex-biased Sub-Saharan contribution to the Northern African gene pool that occurred in historical times. Indeed, it is known that the trans-Saharan Arab slave trade involved twice as many servile women as men, almost the reverse in the Atlantic slave trade ratio. Moreover, a few slaves left descendants, whereas female slaves were imported in Northern Africa as household servants and as concubines, and their offspring were born free, thus contributing to the local gene pool. Thus, we suggest that the Arab slave trade mainly contributed to the mtDNA and autosomal gene pool of present-day Northern Africans, whereas the paternal gene pool was mainly shaped by more ancient events. And that's why when you go up here to this chart, ancestral E1B1A, EM2, it's mainly North African. This hypothesis is in line with genome-wide data obtained from 3 ancient Egyptian mummies dated between 2.5 to 2,000 years ago, showing a not negligible ancient Sub-Saharan component, approximately 6 to 10%, Considering the data for all the 4 trans-Saharan haplogroups reported here, we can try to paint a comprehensive picture of the events during the last African human period. humid period. The first occupation of the Sahara may have occurred from both northern and southern regions, following the spread of the fertile environment according with the two-way occupation of the Green Sahara proposed on the basis of the paleoanthropological evidence. The topology and geographic distribution of both A3M13 and EM2 suggests that the lineages were brought to the Sahara from the southern regions, while EM78 and RV8 seem to have followed the opposite route. The fertile environment established. Oh, let me mention this because again, it's presupposed that E1B1A comes from the Horn of Africa, right? And it's also presupposed that since we see majority of them there, then that's where they come from. So that's where that presupposition comes from. Says the fertile environment established in the Green Sahara probably promoted demographic expansions and rapid dispersals of human groups, as suggested by great homogeneity in the material culture of the early Holocene Saharan populations. Our data for all the four trans-Saharan haplogroups are consistent with this scenario, since we found several multiplicated topologies, which can be considered as phylogenetic footprints of demographic expansions. The multiplicated structure of the EM2 is suggestive of the first demographic expansion, which occurred about 10.5 thousand years ago at the beginning of the last Green Sahara. After this initial expansion, we found that most trans-Saharan lineages within A3M13, EM2, and RVA8 radiated in a narrow time interval at 8 to 7,000 years ago, suggestive of population expansions that may have occurred in the same time. Interestingly, during roughly the same period, the Saharan population adopted pastoralism, probably as an adaptive strategy against a short arid period. So the exploitation of pastoralism resources and the reestablishment of wetter conditions could have triggered simultaneous population expansions observed here. RVA8 also shows signs of a further and more recent, approximately 5.5 thousand years ago, Saharan demographic expansion, which involved the RV1589 internal clade. We observed similar demographic patterns in all other haplogroups and about the same period and in different geographic areas. E3M13, EM2, V3862, and EM78, V32 in the Horn of Africa, EM2/M191 in the Central Sahel and Central Africa, in line with the hypothesis that the start of the desertification may have caused massive economic, demographic, and social changes. Finally, the onset of the arid conditions at the end of the last African humid period was more abrupt in the eastern Sahara compared to the central Sahara, where an extensive hydrogeological network buffered the climate changes, which were not complete before approximately 4,000 years ago. Consistent with these local climatic differences, we observed slight differences among the four trans-Saharan haplogroups. And indeed, we found that the contact between northern and sub-Saharan Africa went on until approximately 4.5 thousand years ago in the Central Sahara, where we mainly found the internal lineages EM2 and RVA8. In the Eastern Sahara, we found a sharper and more ancient, less than 5,000 years ago, differentiation between people from northern Africa and more generally from the Mediterranean area. And the groups from Eastern Sub-Saharan regions, mainly from the Horn of Africa, as testified by the distribution and correlation ages of A3 and 13 and EM78 lineages. Conclusions. Our data suggests that the favorable climatic conditions and the fertile environment established in the Sahara during the last African humid period promoted the occupation and dispersal of human groups and contributed to the present distribution of wild lineages in northern and sub-Saharan Africa. On the contrary, historical events such as the Arab slave trade had only marginal role in the wide genetic composition of African people. Our inferences are based on the assumption that migration events that occurred in recent times are reflected by recent correlation times of wild lineages. To support our assumption, we included in this study a large number of African, European, and Near Eastern ethnic groups, both from our lab collection and from the literature data, in order to consider as much genetic diversity as possible. However, we could not completely exclude the presence of informative haplogroups in other populations, regions absent in our sample collection. More sample efforts could lead to the identification of other informative data from other populations, and these findings could refine our inferences. Nonetheless, this study highlights the importance of the targeted selection and analysis of uniparental haplogroups with a relic distribution to understand past human history, which could be concealed by the genetic changes caused by successful events. Great way to summarize this paper. At the end, just kills all of the detractors. A place or geographical location's history can be concealed by its present day distribution. For example, modern day Europeans are not the very ancient Cro Magnons. A lot of modern day Europeans are the result of the Anaya expansion, even though if we look at frequency wise, they dominate most of Europe, right? But that conceals what the actual peopling of ancient Europe looked like. Same thing with Africa. Same thing with the Near East. Same exact thing. Same principle. All right. So that was the paper in its entirety. We've seen a lot of interesting things dealing with the Green Sahara and the different groups. Two of them were YAP, EM2, and EM78 lineages, E1B1A and E1B1B lineages. As we can see, the ancestral EM2 markers were definitely Northern African. Definitely Northern African. If I scroll up, we keep going. We go back to the other chart that was presented here. RVAA is definitely from Europe, and they are Villa-Brunner related people. AM13 was not restricted to Sub-Saharan Africa as well. But as you can see here in this chart here, we go back down. Go back down here. All these groups converge in the Green Sahara. That's what this green belt is. And as we've seen, the ancestral EM2s are mostly the light blue is Northwest African, and the navy blue, as we see here, is Northeastern African. They're mostly either Northwestern or Northeast African. That's what we see with the ancestral, and that's what we saw in that chart, primarily Northern African. Because that's the origin point of all of these E1B1A clades that come from the Green Sahara, which is in North Africa. Right? And when you go to UT90, it's gray, which indicates a mixture of North and South lineages, as we see in the other chart. And again, people don't want us associated with North Africa because there is no genetic barrier between North Africa and the ancient Near East. Right? It just boils down to that. All right. So I'm getting ready to wrap up. Any questions? And pose your questions in the chat, and hopefully I'm able to answer them. Hopefully you guys learned something, man. Yeah, I got something out of today's presentation. I like to take out the time and read the relevant papers because plenty of people try to quote papers or invoke certain things from papers, but they didn't really take out the time to read and try to get the understanding of the papers. And that's what I try to do with these series here. All right, so let me go to this paper here in Science Daily. Just to back up what I just said, why they don't want to connect E1B1A to North Africa, why certain people's, mainly racist white supremacists, don't want to connect this. When you go down here to this paper here, this is the scientists discovered genomic ancestry of Stone Age North Africans from Morocco. It was written in 2018. Let's go straight to it. Of course, the Sub-Saharan African heritage from a previously unknown population. They connect that to the Europe as well. But let me go to the part where it says, right here. Here's the quote I wanted. It says, the high proportion of Near Eastern ancestry shows that the connection between North Africa and the Near East began much earlier than previously thought, although the connections between these regions have been shown in previous studies for more recent time periods. It was not generally believed that humans were interacting across these distances during the Stone Age. Our analysis shows that North Africa in the Near East, even at this early time, were part of one region without much of a genetic barrier, explains co-senior author Jong. Right? So that's why your boys, man, don't want us to associate E1B1A with North Africa. Because then you open up the can of worms. But it explains what else was found. It explains the early Levantine, Bronze Age Levantine DNA associated with the Bantu agriculture expansion. It explains those things. You know, certain Eurasian admixture that we see in the Fula within 3,000 years ago, the Jola within 3,000 years ago, Wolof within 3,000 years ago, thanks to the AGVP paper that we quoted, right? So let me put this in the chat too, so y'all can have that paper as well. That's the source there. And just in case y'all didn't get the peopling of the Green Sahara paper, let me get that paper for you too. So you can have that paper. Right? Readily available. And Hebrew Thought has a question. So I'm going to answer your question here, brother. Let me just make sure I get these sources in here for you. So this is the peopling of the Green Sahara paper. That's the source there. Here's the title. With that being said, Hebrew Thought has a few questions here. His first question says, but how and when did they interact with Africans? Who are you talking about? Well, who are you referring to here? Oh, you're talking about the Chadic people. He says, or are you saying the ancestors of the Chadic speakers? The ancestors of the Chadic people with RV88 originally existed in Europe, Sardinia and Villabruna, Italy, right? Their ancestors, we have dug up their skeletal remains, exhumed their exhumed their DNA, and sequenced their genome, and they were RV88. So they go from Europe into Africa. That's where their genesis is from, European men. So any more questions? So if there's no more questions, let me address what he said here. Let me go back to the paper. So if you go to the peopling of Green Sahara, then you go to the RV8 section there that we read. It talks about them coming from Europe. Let me see if I can get it. Let's see if we can get it real quick for you. Maybe you missed that part. I have no fear. We here, man. Let me get this. Role of Green Sahara distribution for blah, blah, blah. All right, here it is. RV8 topology indicates a Europe to African migration, and indeed our data suggests a European origin of RV88 about 12.3 thousand years ago, considering both the presence of two Sardinian RV88 basal clades, RM18 and RV35, and that the RV88 marker arose in the RM343 background, which in turn includes Near Eastern European lineages. All right. So hopefully that answers your question, Hebrew Thought. Any more questions? You say so. Judah Jedi says, so who are the R1B all over Europe? The Indo-European Aram came out of northern India. I don't know about that last part, but I'm trying to answer your question. So the R1B that's in present-day Europe, that's mainly from the Yamnaya expansion. The VA8 is a different branch that was there before the Yamnaya expansion, right? The RM269 clades and stuff of that nature, the downstream clades, that comes from your Yamnaya people coming from Central Asia, from the Pontic Steppes, and then eventually migrating and introgressing into present-day Europe right, where they reduced a lot of the early European farmers that had haplogroup G2A, and even had small percentages of like maybe E1B1B carriers, and you also had RVA8 there as well, and you had eye markers there as well. They came in with advanced weaponry, um, and they were able to take down violently. Actually, they called a battle axe people and everything. They were able to take down many of those older European groups and outcompete and take their women and multiply like rabbits. And you fast forward today, now they have the lion's share of males in Europe. Hebrew Thought 2 says, I love the work you brothers do. I do my best to put other people on to talk work. You ever think about putting together one big video with animation illustrations? Yeah, I mean, if I can get the resources to do that or find the people that can do that, yeah, I can do something like that. And that'll be a great piece to put out. Hebrew Thought 2 says, you guys do more to break down our lineages than National Geographic or any of these so-called history YouTubers. Hey, man, we try our best. We try our best, man. Any more questions, y'all, before I get out of here? I want to make this video rewatchable, so we're already almost at the 2-hour mark. We will be going live a little later, so we'll drop the chat and that live, the link in the chat, and you guys come on and speak to us, give your disagreements, your grievances, and whatnot. Anyway, what's high be praised saying here? So exactly, there was no migration E1, B1, and M2 in sub-Saharan Africa, West Africa 5,000 years ago. That is a desperate attempt to still hold on to the outdated theory that E1, B1A, 2 evolved in sub-Saharan Africa. This is why the Ramsey 30 E1B1A sample had absolutely no sub-Saharan African autosomal DNA, show North African, West Asian autosomal. Exactly. Yeah, he wouldn't have. Why would he have sub-Saharan African autosomal? He's not from that region. It's like many of the early EM2 markers. The antecedents to the Bantu did not have large swaths of sub-Saharan African autosomes. Not on this one, Ngozi. Later on, because I want this video to be about what I did, man. I don't want to open up the panel on this one. Mr. Black Tassis says, you're not less spiritual by studying science, but Bible only folks seem to believe anyone who uses science is not a believer and that they themselves are inerrant in their spirituality. Yeah. So many people will say, oh, like even Faithful to God said this, Yashub is going to get so involved with science that he's going to put the Bible down, he's going to put his beliefs down, and he's no longer going to believe in God, he's going to become an atheist. That's the thinking. The thinking is the more scientific you get, the more atheist, the more the more you turn from God or something like that. That's how these people think. But that's could be that's further from the case. The reason why I even got into science is because of my religiosity. That's why I even got into science. And how modern science was developed was through people's religiosity, because it was mainly European Christendom that ushered in modern science. So it's a very weird dichotomy that people make. And catch us on the next stream when me and Avery's here. I want to keep this video separate and short so it can be rewatchable. All right. So catch us on the other one, bro. We'll be live again tonight. Where are we at? Trying to make sure I didn't miss nothing. That's a great point on High Be Praised. Says EM2 migrated south after the Green Sahara 5,000 years ago. There will be evidence of it in Shumalaka samples. The fact that it was absent until 3,000 years ago throws doubt on that theory. Yeah, I agree. Again, they have the agrarian packages. The people of the Sahara already knew pastoralism, and they knew farming. They already had those packages. So why wouldn't they come from the north? And as we showed, the paper says these groups descend from northern E1B1A carriers that are more ancestral to the Bantus. Let's see. Mr. Black Tacit says the primary reasons why folks claim to be Bible only as an excuse are: one, scientific evidence debunks or contradicts their narrative. And point two, they don't have the discipline to study the science. Yeah, they're not going to sit down and read these papers. They're not going to do that. Too much work. Too much work, bro. It requires too much work. Vernon Robinson says, agreed, I've become interested in multiculturalism because of this channel. That's what's up. Yeah, I remember you said that, Amir, about the Kifians. All right. I think I got everything out of the chat. So yeah, subscribe, hit that like button, man. We're gonna be bringing out more episodes like this where we read the secular data and we go from the top to the bottom within the secular data, so you guys can get an understanding. The Green Sahara came up this week, so I want to read both papers that actually deal with the Green Sahara and the peopling of the Green Sahara and the distribution of, E1B1A, because again, E1B1A is not allowed to travel. There's a travel ban on my ancestors. There's a travel ban on E1B1A, especially by these white supremacists that, that lurk on social media, that lurk on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, going around. So we was kings and all that, those groups. So we had to smack them up with the evidence, with the empirical. So y'all know how we rock it, man. And again, remember this, man, this principle here: a new scientific truth is usually not propagated in such a way that opponents become convinced and discard their previous views. So we don't make these videos, we don't make these assessments to convince any damn body. We're not about convincing. It says, no, the adversaries eventually die off and the upcoming generations familiarize anew with the truth. That's our plan, to plant the seeds for some of you guys to get it and pass it on down to the next generation. That's the plan. And with that being said, my brother said, if science can alter your faith, you never truly believed. Yeah, I know, right? Hebrew Thought 2 says, I sent them the link to your video that pissed them off. Oh, man. Remember that, man. We're not here to convince nobody. We're here to sow the seeds so you can pass it down to the next generation. And hopefully the subsequent generations that come after us have a strong grasp of the scientific literature. All right? With that, stay shiesty. We out. Yeah.
You know, truth. You're crazy, man. Go crazy, man. Go crazy. Go crazy. Go crazy. Go crazy, they should put me in a straight jacket. Like I'm running on a Greyhound. I'm hearing voices in my head, I'm going crazy, I don't know who to trust. Chrome hearts are hearted broken, I don't know who to love. I'm holding united on the road with a suit and tie. Everybody putting work in when it's do or die. One orange chicken or bologna, I let you decide. I keep a Big Mac on me, yeah, that's supersize you. Go crazy, I'm riding around with 2 J-Keys. Wayne Gretzky, the ice on me, don't test me. I won't let you a fuck about probation. I'll spray with these cake clips, play with me. Go crazy, I'm running. Go crazy. baby, don't got it all. If it's blood on my shoes, I'ma wipe it off. I don't know, cause your friend, I was not involved. I might just crash a performance, just might shoot shots off assumptions. I'm Michael Myers on Halloween. Shit can get tactical, I nod my head. When I'm carrying this fiend and knock off dreads. If you see me on the 10, it's bop bop blade 'em. Left all these toppers in the street, yeah, my mia. Say why your cameras from the gram, I'm not gon' see 'em. Go, go, go crazy, I'm ready. Go, go crazy. Go crazy. Go crazy. Go.